Growing up as a kid in small-town Maine, I always had to walk past this creepy old house on my way back from school. It used to give me the willies. It looked half dilapidated, and the windows were always so dusty you could never see inside. The lights were always off, and I never got the impression that anyone actually lived there. It was like the quintessential haunted house that you see in a cheesy horror movie. Twice a day, 5 times a week, I speed-walked past that old house. It just had this horrible aura about it. Bad mojo, no bueno. It was summer at the time this happened. I forget how old I was, maybe 12 or 13. School had just finished, and I was walking back to my place by myself. I inevitably get to the old house, and for the first time ever, I saw somebody exiting the property. A man who looked to be in his mid-70s, dressed completely in black, like he was heading to a funeral or something. He had slicked back, medium-length white hair, wrinkles as deep as the Grand Canyon all over his face. He was in the process of walking out the front gate when he stopped me.
Afternoon, young man.
Good afternoon, sir.
Out for a stroll by yourself, huh?
Just heading home, sir.
Heading back to your house, is that right? Your parents are expecting you, I suppose.
An awkward pause followed as he just stared at me.
Your house doesn't look anything like that, does it?
He motioned to the old, rotten house behind him. Oh, no, sir. Not as, old. Do you live here? The old man laughed, seemingly to himself, exposing his brown, crooked teeth. That smile stayed on his face for the rest of our conversation.
Not quite. Though I've been here many, many years now.
Weird, I thought. What kind of answer was that? So what? You're like the gardener or something? The man cackled again.
I like you, son. So I'm going to tell you something I wish somebody told me a long time ago. Never go inside that house, no matter what.
Why? I asked.
That's the maze house. It's a labyrinth.
What's that mean?
It means if you go in, you'll almost certainly end up getting lost. It's much bigger on the inside with hundreds of floors, thousands of rooms, and hallways that go on for miles. Some people never find their way back out of it again. Hell, I wandered in as a young man, only just found my way out now. Decades I've been lost in there. All my little friends I was with didn't make it. Lost them years ago. They're still in there, somewhere. But I kept going.
He took a deep breath of the fresh air.
It's good to finally see another person again.
I figured the old man was just going a little cuckoo. Obviously, I was a little too old at this point to believe such nonsense, but I remained polite and nodded along to the old man's story.
So, you'll stay away, right? Promise me that. I'd hate to think what might happen to you in there.
Yeah, of course, mister.
There's a good boy.
And with that, the old man hobbled on down the road to who knows where, still laughing to himself as he went. I made my way home and told my parents about the old geezer and his story. Told them about the so-called maze house. Sounds like a nut job, they said. Make sure to stay away from him. The years rolled by, and in time, I forgot about the old man and his wild tale. It wasn't until they started demolishing that house that I remembered the encounter and remembered what he had told me. It gave me a good laugh. A good laugh, that is, until the news came out. While taking down the old house, one of the demolition men found something in amongst the ruins. The top of a human skull, nestled in the debris. Phone calls were made, and the authorities came to check the discovery. Unfortunately, that wasn't all they found. In total, the skeletal remains of 3 children were found in the house's foundation. When I heard this, my thoughts turned to the old man I met years ago. Did he know something about those bones? Worse yet, was he the one who put them there? Had he concocted some story about a maze-like house as some kind of sick joke, or even a clue about his crimes? I asked my parents if they remembered me telling them about the old man, if they remembered who he was. They were completely confused, and didn't recall me telling them any such story. Nor did they recall any old man who had lived in that house. As far as they knew, it had been abandoned since we moved to the area. And they were right. There was no record of anyone living in the so-called maze house for decades. It really was abandoned. As far as I know, nobody in my town remembers that old man. None of the local newspapers reported about him. The identities of the 3 skeletons remain unknown, though experts believe they had been in the foundation since at least the 50s, maybe even the 40s. Nothing more has ever come of the case. No leads at all. Nothing. In fact, it's hardly been reported on at all, seeing as everyone assumes these bodies have been there for years and years and years. This has perplexed me for the longest time. Why can't anyone track him down? Why does nobody else remember seeing him around town? Had he somehow been living in that house without anyone ever realizing it? Hell, did I make the whole encounter up in my head? Or maybe, was there really something paranormal about that house? Whatever the case, I'm just glad he told me to stay away and didn't invite me in. Four years ago, a Reddit user posted a chilling story that happened to their mother. Worried that the call might be linked to the Nuclear Defense Agency, the user created the post anonymously under a new account. In 2012, the user received a call from their elderly mother. She was calling from her neighbor's house, and she was absolutely hysterical, sobbing about how somebody had taken over her home phone. The user was confused by what she meant, but then again, she was very old. The neighbor she was with checked out the phone, and everything seemed normal, so eventually she calmed down and returned to her house. A few days passed, and then the same thing happened again. The user's mother called them in a state of pure terror. Once again, she was at her neighbor's house, shaking uncontrollably. This time, she refused to go back to her home. The Reddit user took a week off work to stay with their mother. To begin with, the user couldn't find anything wrong with the phone, and figured that the mother was just going a little senile. That proved not to be the case. Over the next few days, the user discovered what was really going on. Every day, between 7 and 7:15 p.m., a strange message took over their mother's phone. When she lifted the receiver, instead of a dial tone, she'd hear this unsettling message. Outside of that 15-minute window, the phone would work normally. The phone didn't ring at 7 p.m. or anything. It was just that if you lifted it to make a call within those 15 minutes, you'd hear the creepy message rather than the dial tone. If you hung up the receiver and lifted it again, the message would restart. If you hung it up and lifted extremely quickly, the line would appear to be dead until 7:15. The user was able to make a recording of the message. Here's what it sounded like.
Connecting you. Please hold the line.
NORAD, AWS, Station Zulu Foxtrot 77. Zulu Foxtrot 77. Status alert Con 4. Status alert Con 4. Security tracing in progress. Attention. 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 Whiskey 09. Ready. November. Papa 4. Danger. Hotel Papa 87. Ready. Hotel Quebec 39. Ready. Papa Kilo 58. Ready. Foxtrot Charlie 23. Ready. November 18. Trigger. Victor Yankee 92. Ready. Lima Charlie 56. Secure. Attention. Attention. Attention.
For the whole day after they recorded this message, their phone line was dead. The phone company said that they couldn't find a fault in the line. That evening, they attempted to record the message again to see if anything had changed, but rather than be met with the strange message, there was just the normal dial tone again. The message never came back. To this day, the origin of the call remains a mystery, but if you have any theories about this case, or any of the others in this video, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. You may have seen this one before, but I think it's creepy enough to warrant a place in this video. In 2014, a foreman took a camera aboard an old frigate that was dry docked. The ship was being dismantled, and he was tasked with taking pictures of the work areas. He took hundreds of photos and sent them all to his boss. Looking through all the images, the boss came across one in particular that caught his attention. He sent the image back to the foreman with a question. "Who's the guy with the axe at the edge of the camera flash?" This was the image. When you enhance it, it becomes all the more clear and disturbing. The foreman hadn't seen anybody else on board the frigate. It was supposed to be empty. The picture was taken deep in the ship, and it was extremely dark. He was walking around with a torch to guide his way. When he took a photo, he'd turn off the torch, briefly leaving him in total darkness. Then, after he'd snapped his image with the flash on, he'd turn the torch back on and continue through the ship. This man had been lurking in the blackness the entire time. Nobody who worked at the dock recognized the man in the picture. Since it was a military vessel, the boat was thoroughly searched. Nobody was found on board, and the security camera that was pointing at the ship's only exit didn't record anybody leaving either. To this day, nobody has any idea who the axe-wielding man in the image is, or what he was doing on the ship in the first place. Whatever the case, whenever I see this picture, it always gives me the chills. I live on a farm in the Lone Star State, and I have some serious problems with my neighbor. He's a real pain in my behind, to say the least. We have somewhat of a rivalry, seeing how he's a farmer himself. I gotta say though, I'm grateful for that rivalry, and I'll tell you why. I'd been having some trouble with a few of my vehicles a while back. Someone had been slashing their tires. Whoever had done this had also left manure in my mailbox a few weeks earlier, and put broken glass all over my driveway a couple of weeks after that. I was sure that my neighbour was responsible, but when I confronted him about it, he denied any involvement in any of the incidents. I was going to need evidence to prove that it was him. Then I could hit him where it really hurt, namely his wallet. Thus, I installed a few security cameras around my property, small enough as not to be noticeable. My trap was set. Now I just needed to wait for him to strike again. Perhaps a month passed by, and in all that time, there had been no new incidents on my farm. Maybe my neighbour had noticed me installing the cameras. Well, if that was the case, I was just glad it stopped him from coming onto my property, tampering with my vehicles, and pulling all sorts of horrible pranks, if you want to call them that. One afternoon, I found myself driving alone back to my farm. I'd been out of town for the whole weekend visiting family. I was running a little low on fuel, so I stopped at a gas station along the way. I pumped in my gas and went inside the store to pay. Mustn't have been more than 5 minutes. I hopped back in my car and continued on my way, singing to myself and enjoying some alone time on the long journey back. A good 20 minutes passed, and by chance, I recognized someone walking along the road, heading in the direction of my farm. It was one of my farmhands, a young guy who had been working for me for a short while. He was carrying supplies back from town. Why was he walking instead of driving, I wondered. I pulled over and honked at him, motioning for him to get in with me. "Sorry, boss," he said. "I woke up this morning, and you'll never guess what. The tires on the truck have been slashed again. I was going to call you as soon as I got back to the farm." Oh, my neighbour, I suspected. I've got him this time. In a rage, I sped back to my farm, eager to look over my security footage and catch my neighbour in the act, to put a stop to this nonsense once and for all. We arrived back at the farm, rushed inside to the computer, and loaded up that day's footage. There, on CCTV, was a masked figure sneaking onto my property and slashing my tires. It was my neighbour, for sure. His same build, his same scraggly hair hanging out the back of the mask. I was furious, and immediately called the police. Oh, this was juicy. I had finally caught him red-handed. My farmhand and I checked through the rest of the day's footage, seeing if he'd been up to anything else. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. We got to the part where we had just pulled up into the driveway. That's when the footage displayed something that took a while to fully sink in. The footage showed what we expected. In it, you could see my farmhand and I pull into the driveway, get out of the car, and rush into the house. Nothing else happened for a few moments. The car just sat there, parked outside the house. Then, the back door slowly opened. Somebody had been hiding in the back seat of my car. A man I had never seen before in my life carefully exited the vehicle, looking towards the house as if to check if he'd been seen. He then sprinted off my property. I immediately grabbed a rifle and headed outside. I checked the back seat of my car. Nobody else there, thank God, but there was something that made my gut sink. Stabbed into one of the cloth seats was a hunting knife. The cops reviewed the footage and took the matter seriously. They later let me know that they'd reviewed the footage from the gas station I had stopped at as well. They told me that while I was inside paying for my gas, some wacko snuck inside the back seat of my car. He'd been lying down the whole journey back to the farm, hiding mere inches behind me. Why he targeted me and what he planned on doing, I can't say, but nothing else ever came of it. In a way, I'm glad my neighbour caused me so many problems. If it wasn't for him, I'd never have installed those cameras. Nor would I have passed my farmhand on the way back to the farm. I'm guessing that if my farmhand hadn't been in the car with me, things would have ended very differently. It was late one night, and I needed to take the tube, the London Underground Metro, back to my apartment. Unfortunately, I'd failed to keep an eye on the clock. I'd made it to the station, but the last train home was in just a few minutes. I rushed down the escalators, corridors and stairs to the platform, only to see the train doors close right there in front of me. It took off through the tunnel, leaving me stranded. Damn it. I didn't have a lot of cash, so paying for a taxi all the way back to my home was going to sting. I took a seat on the platform so I could rest my weary legs and think for a moment. No more than 2 minutes after the last train had left, to my surprise, I heard the sound of another train coming down the tracks. That was odd, I thought. There had been no announcements through the station speakers, and the sign that displayed all the upcoming trains was just blank. Not to mention, when I checked the timetable for the trains, the previous train was definitely the last one scheduled. I decided not to question it, and just accepted that karma had thrown me a bone. The train began to slow down, and as it did, I could see inside every passing carriage. There was nobody on the train. Each carriage was completely empty. I mean, I figured there wouldn't be many people catching the last train at this hour on a Wednesday, especially since this station was relatively quiet at the best of times, but it seemed odd that there was nobody else on board. As the train came creaking to a halt in front of me, the strangest thing happened. Unlike all the others, the carriage that stopped directly in front of me was absolutely full of people. I was a little weirded out, to be honest. Why was everybody in this part of the train and not the other parts? Only the doors for the full carriage lit up. All the others remained inactive. Guess this journey was going to be a tight squeeze. I got ready to push my way on board, and in typical British fashion, kept my eyes low and my earphones in. Don't want any of that uncomfortable social interaction now, do I? As the doors opened before me, I tried to push past the people standing directly by the door. I'm only a small person, and figured I'd find a little nook to stand in further in the carriage. As I nudged past the first few travellers, though, I noticed something. Their bodies didn't react the way I expected. Their limbs felt hollow as I squeezed past. I mean, it didn't feel like I was pushing past flesh. Even the light force of my body moving past them seemed to make them come unbalanced and stumble from side to side. I took out my earphones to apologize and looked up to make eye contact. It hardly registered at first, but after a second of confusion, I was horrified to see that the man in front of me had absolutely no face. There was just a plastic-looking white space where his face should have been. He had a head, sure, but no facial features whatsoever. He looked just like a mannequin that you'd see at Forever 21 or something. Don't get me wrong, he was moving like a normal person. He just had no face. Just like the woman standing next to him, and the man next to them, and the one beside him, and the woman sat across from me, and the child that was with her. Everybody on board. They were all the exact same. Pure white, plastic-looking, faceless and hairless, dressed in clothes like normal people, like a whole train carriage of mannequins that you'd see in a shop window. And what was worse, from the shape of their heads, I could tell they were all looking directly at me. All of them were dead silent. They literally made no sound. They shuffled and stood up and moved, but there was no talking, no rustling of material, no breathing or any natural human sounds at all. The silence was broken by the train doors. They started beeping, signaling that they were about to close. I immediately pushed back off the train and managed to get out just in time. The thought of being trapped inside with those faceless people, the thought of it even today. The faceless heads in the window continued to stare at me as the train finally pulled away from the platform. It disappeared into the tunnel. I decided paying for a taxi wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. This was easily the eeriest experience of my life, and I can't seem to make sense of it. If it was some kind of prank, it was extremely elaborate. There were too many people involved. Not to mention, they would have had to get their hands on an entire goddamn train. I've steered clear of using the tube at night ever since. Being a police dispatcher can be a tough job emotionally, something that many new operators find out during their training. Learning how to handle distress calls involves listening to a bunch of them, and some, like the one you're about to hear, are harder to sit through than others. This call was made by a woman named Ruth Price and has been used in the training of new dispatchers since the 1980s. Many dispatchers say this is the most disturbing call they've ever heard.
What's the problem, ma'am? Oh, well, there's some guy been checking the place out. How? Well, he went in the back. I have an apartment in the back, and he said he was looking for a guy, and he comes to my door, and yeah, and said he's looking for an apartment. So I live alone, and I'm an old lady. Mm-hmm. Where is he now, ma'am? I have no idea. Operator?
Despite being so prolifically used in dispatcher training, very little information exists about the call. The call is always presented to trainees as 100% authentic. Recruits are always told the backstory to the case, and they're always told that Ruth did not survive the attack. Despite this, pretty much no information about Ruth's case exists online. It supposedly happened before the days of the internet, but you'd think that there'd at least be something out there about it. As one former dispatcher writes,
"In the early 1990s, I worked as a 911 dispatcher in Florida. This call was played for us as part of a training exercise, as an example of why it's so critical to ask for a caller's address before asking anything else. As a result of similar incidents, it's been policy across various police departments to state, 911, what's your location? What little information there is matches up with what I was told in the early 90s. The call was made in 1988. The caller was an elderly woman named Ruth Price. She was killed by a prowler, and the prowler was not apprehended. I'm so frustrated by the lack of any credible information about this call."
Because of the lack of information about the case, it remains a mystery whether this call is genuine or just an amazing piece of voice acting. Another former dispatcher is more certain that the call is real.
Although there were rumors that this was fake when it first came out, sadly, the recording is 100% real. The recording is used in police training on what not to do during a 911 call, and why you should always get the location or address first. Because of the 911 operator not getting that info and not really taking her seriously, the cops never got out there in time, and the killer was never caught. There's little info out there on Google, as this happened way back in the 80s, before the internet or Google existed, but there was a thread posted about it on a police forum back in 2002. I'll try to find it and link it, but from what I remember, I'm pretty sure she was beaten or bludgeoned to death.
If you scour some online forums, you'll still find people debating whether this call's real or fake. Whatever the case though, the prospect of receiving a call like this is enough to put anyone off becoming a police dispatcher. That much I'm sure of. here's a glitch in the Matrix that's kept me up for more than a few nights. For as long as I can remember, I've had a memory that apparently never even happened to me. It's extremely vivid, almost like I can feel what's happening in the memory itself whenever I think about it. The memory stayed the same since I was a kid. It starts with this horrible, pale man looking in at me through a window. His skin is so thin, it's almost translucent. His eyes are a sickly yellow, and they're sunken deep in his skull. His whole face is emaciated and bony, and his mouth is contorted into a menacing smile. In a flash, he's in the same room as me. I don't know where we are, some sort of dark, featureless place, but it's just the two of us, and I have no idea why I'm there. The pale man slowly approaches me with his arms outstretched, and I'm overcome with this feeling of pure fear. Then, pure pain. Next thing I know, I'm in a hospital on a stretcher, being wheeled into the emergency room. I can't really feel the lower half of my body, and everything's a little blurry. The doctors have concerned looks on their faces, and one of them keeps repeating, "Stay with me, Tom. Stay with me, Tom." The strange thing is, my name's not Tom. It's Jason. I look up at the doctor talking to me. I still remember his face like it was yesterday. Paper-thin lips, a brown moustache, piercing blue eyes, a big mole over his eyebrow. The scene goes on like that until I lose consciousness. Then, everything goes black. That's where the memory ends. As a child, I brought the memory up to my parents. They assured me I had never been rushed to the hospital, let alone to the emergency room. Throughout the years, I'd periodically bring it back up whenever it popped into my head. Still, they'd always tell me I was just remembering some weird nightmare or something. For the longest time, I put it down to me watching some kind of scary movie before bed, and my young, impressionable mind confusing a dream with reality. When I was 18, my family and I moved to Chicago. I had a minor medical problem that needed monitoring, and I needed to make a trip to the local hospital. I was sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by a handful of other people. An old lady, a mother and a child, and a man with his head burrowed in a newspaper. Eventually, the doctor came out and called my name. I looked up at him, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the doctor from my false memory. The same thin lips, piercing blue eyes, even the same distinctive mole over his eyebrow. He looked older, sure. His moustache was more grey than brown now, and there were a few deep wrinkles on his skin, but there was no mistaking it. If that memory really never happened to me, then how was that even possible? My heart began to race as I stood up and moved towards him. With a reassuring smile, he ushered me into the examination room. Now, in private and up close, I was able to get an even better look at the guy. It was him all right. He wasn't just a character from a dream at all. But if that experience from my memory had never really happened, how could I have known this man's face? Why had it been stuck in my head for my entire life? During his examination, I told him he looked familiar. He assured me we had never met. I grew up in Texas, and he'd never even been there. Not to mention, there was no record of me as a patient there, and the doctor said he had a keen eye for faces. I figured it was some kind of weird coincidence, a sort of mind glitch. My brain must have been making a connection that wasn't really there. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The doctor finished up his examination, told me everything looked good. He then gave me a smile and showed me the door. I walked out into the waiting room, and the doctor called his next patient. It was the man with his head in his newspaper, sitting just to the right of me. He stood up and towered over the doctor and I. Couldn't have been less than 6'6". He came to pass me, and I looked up at him. Those sickly, sunken eyes, those emaciated cheeks, that cellophane-like skin. It was him, the menacing figure from my memory. The doctor looked older, but this guy, This guy hadn't changed, hadn't aged a day. But it's what he said to me as we passed that stuck with me the most. He looked down at me and smiled that contorted smile. "Good to see you again, Tom." My heart slammed against my ribcage. He entered the examination room, and the doctor closed the door. I couldn't believe the words that had come out of his mouth. Tom. He called me Tom. How? Why? Who are those two men? I have no idea what to make of this. Back in 2008, I was taking a long trip through the USA, hitchhiking most of the way to save on travel expenses. At the time, I was in Connecticut and trying to get from New Haven to Hartford. This was actually near the end of my journey, as I'd started on the West Coast and had only had positive experiences the entire way. Friendly strangers offering me rides, kind locals offering me couches to sleep on, the whole shebang. Connecticut, unfortunately, is where my trip turned a little sour, and I finally came to realize the dangers of hitchhiking. Some guy I had just met offered me a ride up to Hartford. Said he was headed there himself, and wouldn't mind a little company on the journey. Sounded good to me. Nothing about him seemed suspicious or anything, just a normal-looking dude. He was around 40 years old, muscular, like an outdoorsy type of guy. Had a picture of his family on the dashboard, a crucifix around his neck, and spoke real polite and friendly. We started rolling on down the road, and he gets to talking with me. Conversation was light-hearted and jovial, and we spent a lot of the time sitting back and listening to country music on the radio. I asked him what he had been up to that day before he picked me up. He told me nothing major, just saying goodbye to a few friends he had been visiting in the area. Somewhere between New Haven and Meriden, this guy's demeanor suddenly changed. His face went from smiley to serious. The whole atmosphere in the vehicle became darker. I tried talking to him, but he stopped answering me. After about 10 minutes of the silent treatment, he finally spoke. "You know," he said, "when you asked me what I'd been up to all day, I told you I was saying goodbye to friends." Yeah, I replied, not really sure what he was getting at. "I ain't got no friends in New Haven." "Oh," I said, a little unsure of how to feel. There was a long pause as I waited for him to tell me the punchline to this joke or whatever he was building up to. He didn't say anything. I waited a good 30 seconds before asking, "So, what have you been doing all day then?" He turned off onto some thin, country road with trees lining either side. This definitely didn't feel right. The guy sniffed, and, with a blank expression, simply replied, "Digging a hole." My heart was pounding fast now, and became faster as we drove further down the lonely road, the surrounding trees becoming more dense. In that moment, I questioned whether jumping out of the car would have been an overreaction. I decided it wasn't. I unbuckled my seatbelt as the guy began gaining speed, opened the door, and flung myself out of the vehicle. I didn't know what this guy had planned for me, but I didn't want to be a part of it. I rolled on the ground, scraped but mostly uninjured. The guy's car came to a complete standstill up ahead of me, and the red reverse lights came on. He started flooring it in reverse, coming back to get me. I darted down the road, back the way we came, all the while with this guy catching back up to me. I had no choice now. I ran into the woods on my right side, where his car could no longer pursue me. I rushed through the foliage and heard the guy slam his car door, hollering about how I was a stupid so-and-so and how I wasn't going to get away. From the sounds of it, he was chasing behind me, though I didn't dare to turn back and look. I refused to stop moving. Adrenaline is a hell of a thing, and it carried me far enough and fast enough for that guy to lose track of me. When I finally felt like I had lost him, I found a spot to lay low and remained hidden in those woods for a good hour or so. I eventually made it back to the main road, found help, and called the police. I gave them a full description of the guy and his vehicle, and, being the sweethearts they were, they gave me a ride to the nearest town. My trip across the USA taught me many things, mainly that most people are inherently good, but I have no doubt I encountered evil that day. The way he was able to shift gears so quickly from friendly to stone cold, that's the part that keeps me up at night. I live in a rural part of Colorado, on a farm close to the infamous Riverdale Road. A lot of strange goings on along that road, let me tell you. People have claimed to have seen all kinds of apparitions while traveling down it. One part of the road even leads off to a mansion that was once the headquarters of a satanic cult. Some folks say that the gates to hell are located there by the chicken coop, but that doesn't really have anything to do with this story. At least, I hope it doesn't. I must have been 14 years old at the time, doing some schoolwork at home, when, all of a sudden, my brother came running in, hollering, said that a mangy dog had wandered onto our property. My dad and I went out to take a look with him. Lo and behold, there was a humongous Doberman standing about 20 yards from our house, completely motionless. It didn't look healthy at all. Dobermans are almost always black, with patches of brown. This one was off-color, grey and covered in blisters. It looked as if it was decomposing, despite still being alive, if only barely. Its eyes, they weren't like alive creatures. They were stark white, like it was blind or something. No pupils or colour at all. It was panting heavily, and just looked at us, begging to be put out of its misery. We had no idea where it could have come from. There wasn't another house near ours for as far as the eye could see, and of the houses that were nearby, well, none of them had a Doberman. My dad didn't want the thing to suffer, and he certainly didn't want it spreading disease to our livestock, so he got his rifle and told us to go back inside. We knew what he meant. We went back and switched on the TV. No more than a few seconds later, we heard a shot ring out from the outside. My dad then dug a grave and buried the poor creature in a patch of unused land away from our house. That night, we all woke up to the sound of aggressive barking from outside. That was odd. We got up to check what it was. Outside our house was another Doberman, looking identical to the one that had wandered onto our property in the day. This one, too, was diseased looking, missing half its fur and covered in lumps. Where were these dogs coming from? Like the one before, this one was just standing motionless, waiting in the exact same place. What were different this time, though, were the eyes. They were still stark white, but they weren't like before. They were shiny, the color of the moon, like they were glowing. They stood out against the darkness of the night. "Where are you poor creatures coming from?" my dad asked it, rhetorically. "Look away, boys," he said. We ignored his command. After staring at the beast for a few moments, my dad raised his rifle again and fired at the animal's head. It collapsed to the ground. "Get back to bed," he told us. We did as he said this time, but couldn't get much sleep. Dad went to dig another grave beside the one that he had made earlier. But that's the thing. The grave he'd dug for the other dog was empty. It had been dug out from the inside. The dog he'd just shot, it was the same dog as before. He placed the strange animal back in the empty hole, filled it back up with earth, and retired to bed. We all put it down to the creature's will to live. Next morning, when we all woke up, we went to check on the grave. The damn thing was empty, dug out from the inside again, tracks leading off to the woodland near our house. After that, we never saw the dog again, though to this day, about once every 3 months, we hear that same barking coming from the woods near our house. Occasionally when we do, we'll look outside the window and see one of our farm animals standing in the exact same place that dog stood, just watching us, waiting for the gun. Sometimes it's a pig, sometimes just a hen, but no matter what, they always look decomposed. They never move, and at night, they all have those bright, moon-like eyes. Had to put down at least a dozen of them over the years. I don't know what that dog brought to our farm, but it ain't going away. I live in Iowa. If you've never paid us a visit, then let me tell you a little bit about our state. We have cornfields. Lots and lots of cornfields. One grey afternoon, I was driving through the countryside, about 30 minutes outside of Farley. The road I was driving on was flanked by 2 of these cornfields on either side. They were tall and went on for miles. The closest thing to civilization nearby was a farm, so essentially, this was as close to the middle of nowhere as you could get without wandering off into the wilderness. As I made my way down the road, I came across something unexpected. A car stuck in a ditch next to the cornfield, and a thin, long-haired man frantically waving for help. I pulled up beside him and wound down my window to check what was wrong. "Hey stranger, having some car trouble here. Could you lend me a hand?" I nodded, pulled over in front of his car, and hopped out of my truck. "Damn man, what happened?" "Oh, the darndest thing. A damn critter jumped out of the corn here, and I swerved to miss it. Ended up in the ditch. No good deed goes unpunished, right?" I felt for the guy. I mean, his car was a hunk of old junk, and he looked and smelled like he hadn't had a shower since God knows when. Must have been down on his luck. "Sure, man," I said. "I'll help you out." "Awesome, thanks so much. I've got a tow rope in the back seat of my car there. Go over and grab it. We can hook him up." I walked over to the guy's car and looked in through the window. I couldn't see a tow rope. Must have been stuck down there somewhere. I then reached for the door handle. Actually, man," I said, "I have a tow rope in my truck. It's a tough one, and I know how to use it. My friend that's with me can help us too." Yeah, sure." I calmly began walking back to my truck and flashed the guy a friendly smile. But I didn't have a tow rope, and I didn't have a friend with me either. As I went to open that guy's car door, I saw something in the reflection of its window. 2 men hiding in the cornfield behind me. I got back to my truck, jumped inside, turned the keys, and floored it out of there. As I sped down the road, I looked in my rearview mirror. The long-haired man just stood there as 3 other men stood up and walked out of the corn. They all joined him and watched me as I drove away. These 3 new men were holding long objects, maybe metal poles or something like that. I couldn't quite make them out. Nor could I make out the license plate on the car. I just got the hell out of there. Sadly, without that information, there was little the police could do. They couldn't find the men or the car when they searched the road, and I never heard anything more about it from them. In hindsight, the man's car wasn't really all that stuck in the ditch. I should have been more cautious and sensed that something was up from the start. I'm just thankful they didn't pursue me. My co-worker and I were driving through northern Arizona on Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page. It was late, something like 2 a.m. We had recently finished our late night shift. Up ahead on the lonely road, I noticed a set of glowing eyes in my headlights. Must be an animal up in the middle of the road. Not wanting to hit the critter, I let my foot off the gas and slowed down to go around it. As we came to pass it, I saw that it wasn't one animal at all. There were 4 or 5, well, coyotes or dogs I guess, gathered around something in the road. But there was something wrong with all of them. They all looked up at us as we came up beside them, and their faces were contorted, morphed. Their features are not in the right place. The thing that they were huddled around in the road appeared to be another dead coyote, all bloody and crooked, like it had been hit by a car. As we drove off, my co-worker told me that one of the coyotes was following behind us. I looked in my mirror, and sure enough, one of them was chasing us off the shoulder of the road. As we gained speed, so did the coyote. I floored it and looked over. I swear to God, the bloody creature stood up on its hind legs and was keeping pace with our vehicle, looking more human than animal now. How it was moving so goddamn fast, I don't know. It was charging towards our vehicle. Luckily, as we picked up speed, we managed to outpace the thing. I could see in my mirror that it continued to chase behind us, becoming smaller and smaller in my vision before fading into the distance. We spent the rest of our journey back home trying to wrap our heads around what we had just seen. I dropped my co-worker off at his house, both of us just as confused as when the event had happened. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard strange noises coming from the woods outside my house. It almost sounded like coyotes, but not quite. Something was off about their cries. They sounded distorted and slower than natural. Their wails went on for a good long while. I refused to look outside my window, terrified that I'd never be able to unsee the image waiting for me. The wailing suddenly stopped. Then, quick footsteps approached my house. Whatever was in those woods was now outside my window. A human voice spoke. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Go to sleep." It was like 2 different voices coming from one source. It's hard to explain. These words repeated several times in exactly the same way, like a recording. As they did, a loud ringing filled my ears like tinnitus, getting louder and louder. It was becoming too much to bear. A few seconds and a heart attack later, the ringing and the voices abruptly stopped, and the normal silence of the Arizonan countryside was all that filled the air. After all that noise, it sounded quieter than it ever had before. I heard nothing more that night. The scariest part, to me, was when I met up with my co-worker the next evening. I told him about the strange noises outside my house during the night. His face became ghostly pale. "Dude," he said, "I heard the same noises last night too." Several years later, I heard from a native gentleman about these creatures called skinwalkers. Creatures that can mimic the appearance and noises of other creatures that they've killed in the past, including humans. They usually can't imitate their victims perfectly though, and something about them almost always looks and sounds off. He also mentioned that they can only repeat the last words and screams of their prey, and that they'd used them to try and lure people into their midst. After hearing his description of these creatures, I remembered my experience years earlier. I couldn't help but wonder if those are what my co-worker and I encountered on Highway 89 that night. I told the native my story. "Huh, you got lucky," he said. "They usually don't leave people alone. Not until they get them." I grew up in a small community in Pennsylvania. I was young at the time, maybe 4 or 5 years old. This is the earliest thing I can remember in any detail, mainly because it's the kind of thing you can never forget. My parents went out for dinner one night with friends. They had arranged for one of our neighbors, a teenager called Laurie, to come over and watch me. She was a nice girl, friendly and always smiling. Let me stay up and watch TV past my bedtime, so she was cool in my books. That particular night, I remember I was watching Aladdin for the 400th or 500th time. Eventually, Laurie came in and told me it was time to go to bed. She led me upstairs into my room, tucked me in, and made sure I was okay. Then she flicked off the light and wished me a good night. Not long after, I awoke to the sound of a car pulling up outside our house. My parents must be home, I figured. I was wrong. Within seconds of hearing the car outside, Laurie came rushing up the stairs. Sam, sweetie, get up." She came charging into my bedroom, desperately trying to hide the obvious look of fear on her face. What had rattled her so much? Before I had a chance to ask what was wrong, she lifted me out of bed. "Sam, sweetie, don't be scared, okay?" she said in a hushed tone. She quickly pulled open my closet door with her free hand. Then she sat me inside it. "Whatever happens, just stay in here, okay? Don't make a sound, just like in hide and seek. You have to stay real quiet. Got it?" My little heart was beating fast, but I didn't know what to say, what to ask. Were we playing a game? Was something bad happening? I remained silent and confused. "You promise you can stay quiet?" she asked me. I nodded my head, yes. Laurie flashed me a smile. Even as a kid, I knew it was forced. Then she lifted her finger up to her lips. Shh. And with that, she closed the closet door. I sat inside that dark closet, hunched up in a ball, listening intently to what was going on. I heard Laurie speedily make her way down the stairs. Then I heard the sound of the front door opening. She was talking with someone. I don't know who. A man with a deep voice by the sounds of it. Then another male voice chimed in. I don't know what was being said, but within 30 seconds, things had escalated. There was shouting, followed by a whole lot of screaming. Laurie's screaming. To this day, I've never heard anything like it. High-pitched cries of pure terror, as if from an animal that knew it was about to be slaughtered. I could hear scuffles, and the men were shouting. Soon, Laurie's voice began to fade, as if she was being dragged outside by the men. Then I heard her screams no more. Everything below me went quiet. Whoever was down there had now left the building, taking Laurie with them. I kept to my word and stayed hidden in the closet. From the outside, I could just about hear a single set of footsteps entering the house again. Whoever it was walking around the entirety of the lower floor. I could trace their movements from the sound of their boots pounding on the floorboards. They moved from the hallway, into the living room, through the dining area and into the kitchen, then back to the hallway once more. They began to make their way up the stairs. Sweet Lord. They made their way through each room. Their footsteps were slow and methodical. I heard my bedroom door creak open. From the crack under the closet door, I could see the shadow of someone's feet standing in the middle of my room. It wasn't Laurie. I raised my hand to my mouth to silence my breathing. They stood there, presumably scanning the room. Then, after a few seconds passed, made their way back out and walked back down the stairs. A car engine began flaring outside, and the house fell silent once again. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed hidden in that closet, terrified that there was someone outside waiting to get me. After what could have been an hour or an eternity, my parents finally arrived home. I was safe. Nobody ever saw Laurie again. The authorities never found her. Nobody knows where those men took her or what they did with her. Despite all the screaming and there being neighbors around, apparently nobody saw or heard a thing, which to me has always seemed weird. I don't know who came to take her that night. I don't know how they knew where she was, what she had done to them, or even what they wanted. Now I'm a fully grown adult, and, looking back, I wonder if she got mixed up in some bad business, mixed in with the wrong crowd, so to speak. Whatever the case, I remember she was a nice person, and she didn't deserve what happened to her. She definitely saved me that night, though. For that, I'll be eternally grateful. I remember moving house not long after that incident. My parents couldn't stand the thought of living in that neighborhood after that. The following story was translated from the Japanese website 2chan. I live on the outskirts of Sapporo in Hokkaido, Japan. It's an extraordinarily safe place to live, albeit a little freezing cold. This story just so happened to take place during a particularly cold winter there. The whole area was covered in snow, and the sun was beginning to set. I was power walking along the Ishikari River, desperately trying to get home. Even after living here for the past 10 years, I still haven't gotten used to that damn cold. As I made my way along the riverside, I noticed a man up ahead, standing with his back to me. He had his hood up over his head, and, despite all the snow, he was barefoot. I scanned the area, and there was absolutely nobody else around. Now, as I mentioned, I lived in an extremely safe part of the world, but even still, I felt a little uneasy. There was just a weird atmosphere about the guy. The way he was standing completely still with his back turned to me. Well, he obviously wasn't looking at the river. Was he just standing there, staring at the ground? Not to mention, I'm a 5'2" petite woman, and this guy appeared to be at least 6 foot, very tall by Japanese standards. Still, I put all those worries to the back of my mind. The man remained perfectly still as I came to pass him. I muttered a quiet, "Good evening," under my breath, in a vain attempt to ease my unease, I suppose. He didn't reply as I walked past. All I could hear were the sounds of my footsteps, rhythmic and predictable. After 10 or 15 steps, though, something interrupted the flow of their beat. I turned around and saw that the barefoot man was following behind me now. But his face, the best way I can describe it is like a mannequin, or one of those wooden figures that artists use. Don't get me wrong, his face was fleshy, but there were no features. His head was faceless, just like an operabo from Japanese folklore. As I picked up my pace, he did as well. Now, extremely frightened, I broke out into a sprint, desperate to get away from the faceless man. Looking back over my shoulder, I could see that the man was running at full speed as well, no longer just keeping pace, but actually gaining on me. I'd never felt such fear in my life. I managed to make it to a corner with a bridge. From it, passing cars could see me. If this was the end, there'd at least be witnesses. I turned around one final time to see how close the man was to me now. But that's the thing. He was just standing there, frozen in place once again. He stood, facing me, if you want to call it that, and remained motionless as I fled into the distance. I ran all the way back to my home, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? What should I tell them? That I saw a noperabo? As the night went on, I continued to deliberate. By midnight, I decided to sleep on it. I fell into a deep slumber, exhausted by the events of the evening. I was awoken by a series of loud, melodic notes. It was my front doorbell. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock next to my bed. 3 a.m. What the hell? To say I was surprised would be an understatement. I have an app on my phone with a camera that's linked to my doorbell. That way, I can see who's standing at my front door without ever having to get up and check. I opened the app to see who in God's name was ringing my doorbell at 3 in the morning. The live footage from the camera popped up. Standing at my front door, with his head close up to the camera, was that same faceless figure I had seen by the river. It had somehow followed me. I dropped my phone in a state of pure shock. In a panic, I immediately ran into my bathroom and locked the door. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to call somebody for help. The police, my parents, my friends or my neighbors, I didn't care. Just anybody who could make this faceless man disappear. Stupidly, I had left my phone on my bed after I dropped it, but I was far too scared to leave the safety of my locked-on suite. After 20 minutes, I finally worked up the courage to go and get it. I lifted my device, and, with my eyes half covered by my hands, reopened the app to see if he was still standing in my doorway. The live feed popped up again. The faceless man was nowhere to be seen. I took the opportunity to call my father. I told him some strange man had stalked me to my house, that he had come for me in the night. Needless to say, he rushed over and arrived only a few moments before a police car. He had taken the liberty of calling them for me. I explained the situation to them all, told them about bumping into a faceless man by the river. I showed them my app, which confirmed my doorbell had indeed been activated at 3 in the morning. Frustratingly, the app didn't have a record function, so I had no definitive evidence to show them. "Okay," said one of the cops. "Be on the lookout for a man with no face." Got it. I thought he was mocking me, so I insisted I was being serious. "Oh, believe me, I'm taking this seriously, ma'am," he said. "You're not the first one around here to report this guy." As of right now, nothing's come of their investigation. I don't know how many people in my town have claimed to have seen this guy, but from what the cop said, I at least know I'm not the only one. There's one final detail I have to share. When the police searched the area, they found a set of footprints in the snow, mud and grass around my house. They led from my front doorstep all the way around the perimeter of my house. Whoever had left them had stopped outside every one of my ground floor windows. The prints had obviously been made by somebody walking barefoot. No DNA could be extracted from them. There used to be this old, abandoned house just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. A real run-down, 2-story building that had just been left to rot away. In our teenage years, my good friend Sam and I were keen explorers, so this place seemed like prime real estate for us to check out. We dreamt of finding some lost treasures hidden in the attic, or something cool left behind in the basement. We'd occasionally walk past the place and stood outside looking at it, talking about actually going inside. Well, one weekend, we decided that's exactly what we were going to do. It was the early afternoon, around 1 p.m. Like I said, this house wasn't actually in the city. It was relatively secluded, so we felt confident that no one would disturb us. We approached the house and tried to look in through the windows. They were so dusty that we couldn't make out anything inside. I tested the handle to the front door, and to our surprise, it had been left unlocked. It creaked open, and we were immediately hit by this horrible, stale smell, the kind of stench that so many abandoned places have. "Hello?" Sam shouted, half joking, half serious. There was, of course, no reply, so we stepped into the dark hallway and tested the light switch. No power, so no dice. Because of the dirty windows, there was hardly any light coming into the house, so it took a moment for our eyes to adjust to the darkness. Once they had, we crept into the living room on our left, both of us a little nervous and excited at the same time. Those emotions turned to confusion when we saw what was inside. There, set up on a tripod, was a large video camera. It looked completely out of place. This house had obviously been deserted for many years, and all of the furniture inside was old and decaying. Yet there stood a brand new camera, set up and ready to go. It stood out like a sore thumb. It was pointing at the wall. The floor just in front of it had been completely covered in sheets, and all of the furniture in the room was covered in plastic. A sinking feeling started swirling in my gut, and became heavier when I heard a horrifying noise. Somebody had just locked the back door. Panic set in, and the two of us turned and made for the front door we'd just entered through. The silent house was now aflood with noise, as we heard the creaking of floorboards above our heads and the muffled whispers of people coming down the stairs. It sounded like there were 4 or 5 people, all charging down towards us. We made it outside, back into the light of day. As we bolted off, I turned and saw something I'll never forget. A man outside the front of the house, who had obviously been creeping around to lock the front door as well. I don't know how many people were upstairs when we escaped, but had that guy managed to lock the door before we got out, we'd have been trapped inside with all of them. I don't want to think about what they had planned with that camera, but I knew we'd just got incredibly lucky. The man outside simply watched as we ran as far away from that house as our legs would take us. We told our parents about the incident, who, in turn, told the cops. They eventually got around to searching the place, but by the time they did, it was completely empty, and there was no sign of any video camera. Nothing else seemed out of place, and nothing else ever came of it. That old house has since been demolished. I hope those men never found some other place to lure people into. Then again, they were all inside there already, waiting for somebody to walk in, so I'm guessing this wasn't their first attempt. And I'm also guessing explorers like us aren't so uncommon after all. I hope I'm wrong. I have thalassophobia. This is defined as an intense and persistent fear of the sea or of sea travel. It can also include the fear of being in large bodies of water, fear of the vast emptiness of the sea, of sea waves, and of distance from land. Most people find this odd, considering I grew up on an island in the Pacific Northwest. My relationship with the ocean is one of love and hate. I find it beautiful and mysterious and terrifying all at the same time. I can ride a ferry or a boat like riding in a car, and I can even swim in the shallows. It's what's beyond there that scares me. This experience is responsible for that fear. I was 10 years old. My grandparents lived right on the beach where the ferry docks. When I say right on the beach, I mean there was only a 20-foot-long yard and a stone bulkhead separating their home from the shore. I grew up digging for clams when the tide was low, building forts from driftwood and swimming in the freezing cold waters of Puget Sound. I had no fear of the sea. I guess it also helped that my parents' home was close to the ocean too. This particular morning, my grandfather had recruited me to help him repair one of the crab pots that he had set up the previous week. It was early, and there was a layer of fog covering the water. I hopped in the small boat and buckled my life jacket as my grandfather pushed us out into the sea. I let my fingers slide across the top of the water as we moved farther and farther out. The sea became darker and darker. Soon I could no longer see the bottom. We stopped at the bright orange and red buoys that marked our pots. While my grandpa pulled up the broken one, I stared over the side of our small boat. I could see a small school of fish swimming just below the surface. My grandpa asked me for some pliers. I reached down into the bag of tools in front of me and pulled out a pair. As I handed them to my grandpa, I looked over the edge of the boat again. The school of fish had scattered quickly. I looked closer into the darkness and saw 2 eyes staring back at me. I knew what fish eyes looked like, and these were not the eyes of a fish. They looked human. They were large and wide, and they were coming closer, rising from the depths of the water. They were wild and horrible. I jerked back, causing the boat to rock. My grandpa grabbed the back of my life jacket to stop me from falling over the edge. "Whoa, kiddo, what's got you spooked?" I pointed into the water and just said, "Eyes." My grandpa looked at me quizzically and then peered over the side of the boat where I'd been. Now, my grandpa was an Irish World War II veteran, a former boxer who was covered in tattoos. Not a lot rattled the guy. When he looked back at me, I saw the distress on his weathered face. Without a word, he threw the crab pot he had been working on back in the water. "Jules, don't look into the water, okay? And keep your hands in your lap." The tone of his voice was low and serious, but I could tell by the way he called me by my nickname he was trying to keep me calm. I was the baby of the family, and my grandpa had always been fiercely protective of me. He rowed back to shore faster than I thought a 76-year-old man could. Of course, my curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced into that dark water. About a foot below the surface, I saw what looked like black hair floating, moving through the water. I yelped and felt tears rolling down my cheeks. When the boat hit the rocky sand, my grandpa jumped out and pulled the boat out of the water. I was too scared to move. My grandpa picked me up and carried me up the stone steps to the yard. He didn't set me down until we walked through the front door. My grandma was standing in the living room with a concerned look on her face. "Sweet Jesus, Richard, what's wrong? You're as white as a sheet." He set me down and knelt down next to me. "Go in your grandma's room and watch TV, okay?" he said to me, ruffling my hair and wiping a tear from my cheek. I ran into her bedroom and jumped on her big bed where their black cat, Dynamite, was sleeping. I cuddled up next to him as he purred. I strained my ears to listen to my grandparents going back and forth in the living room. "Barbara, they were human eyes, like some goddamn banshee rising up from the depths of hell. Scared the kid half to death." My grandmother didn't say anything. "I'm not taking the kids out on that boat. Not anymore." I tried to focus on the TV. I tried not to think about those eyes, what that thing could have possibly been. I had nightmares for weeks after that. As I got older, the memory seemed to fade. It still lurked in the back of my mind, but not as strongly as it did before. I often wondered if I had really seen it at all, if, in my adolescence, I had let my imagination get away from me. When I was a junior in high school, my grandfather passed away. Before he did, I remember sitting in the living room with him. He rocked back and forth in his old chair as he carved the hunk of wood in his hand. "Hey, do you remember that time that we went out to fix the crab pot and we saw that thing in the water?" I asked him. I half expected him to look at me like I was crazy, but he didn't. He stopped rocking. He didn't look up from his carving, but I could see his facial expression change. "Yeah, but there was something I didn't tell you at the time. You were too young, and I didn't want to spook you any more than you already were. When I was pulling the boat in, I saw a head poking out the water. Just the top. It was covered in black hair, and those eyes were staring right at me. That's why I picked you up out of the boat and carried you. I didn't want to chance that thing snatching you." I sat there in disbelief. Even at 83 and having survived 2 heart attacks and a stroke, this still shook him to the core. Not too long after this conversation, my grandfather passed away. As I said in the beginning of the story, I have a love-hate relationship with the ocean. It's beautiful and mysterious, but I'm sure that in its depths harbor dark things we cannot even begin to fathom. Whenever I ride the ferry, which is often, I find myself staring into the inky abyss of the sound and expect to see those eyes staring back. I live in a small town that sits alongside Bayou Teche, a huge body of water that stretches on for 125 miles in the heart of Cajun country. Where we're from, there's a little-known urban legend. Only folks who live around the bayou seem to know about it, and even then, only in certain circles. I only came to learn about it after I had an encounter with this thing myself. I'll get straight to it. I was out walking with a couple of friends of mine a few years back. One of those boring summer afternoons where you don't have anything to do but wander around aimlessly. Out of nowhere, all the sounds around me stopped. All I could hear was an eerie, loud breathing filling the air. It wasn't my breathing, nor the breathing of my friends. It was coming from elsewhere, but it was loud, and it was prominent, and it was literally the only thing I could hear. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked my friends. Well, I think I asked. I could feel the words escape my mouth, come out of my throat, but I couldn't hear them. I couldn't hear what my friends were saying back to me either. Their lips were moving, but all I could hear was that damn breathing. No birds, or rustling, or footsteps, or any other natural sounds at all. It was surreal. "Hold up," I said, and tried to say, and motioned for my friends to wait for me. I then moved towards where I thought the breathing was coming from, behind a few trees next to the bayou. As I got closer, the sound of the breathing became louder and louder. I knew what curiosity did to the cat, but nonetheless, I followed that damn breathing to its source. It's hard to explain why. I just felt compelled to. It was like a magnet, drawing me in. The weird part was the different sound of each breath. They were more like gasps, if that makes sense, like the person was struggling to breathe. They were all different from each other too, as if every breath was coming from a different set of lungs. I continued on to where I thought it was coming from. I came to a break in the foliage. There, 30 feet ahead of me, sitting on the edge of the bayou, was a man. He was wearing a Western-style hat and a brown leather jacket. That's about all I could make out, seeing how his back was turned to me as he looked out across the muddy water. He was completely motionless, like he was really focused on something, but there was no doubt in my mind that the breathing was coming from him. Despite the weirdness of the situation, he didn't seem scary to me. I felt calm and serene. For whatever reason, I thought about approaching him. I managed to shake that thought out of my head, and instead called out a soundless, "Hey!" Only the man's head moved. It slowly turned around to face me. His skin was the same shade as the leather of his jacket, and he looked to be half decayed. He had no lips, no eyes, just exposed teeth and 2 huge black holes. After staring at me for a few seconds, the man began to stand up. All sounds came back to me in that instant. As I looked into those dark pits in his face, my sense of calm disappeared. Now all I was filled with was dread. I bolted and ran back to my friends, told them we needed to leave immediately, and explained everything on the way. Most of them told me I was crazy, but one of them told me to come and talk with his grandparents. You see, the folks whose family have lived around Bayou Teche for generations, they know about the man. I've heard several names floating around for him. Swamp Man, the Cajun Devil, but most just call him the Bayou Man. They say he's like a siren, that he travels around the circumference of Bayou Teche on a continuous loop and draws people away from their friends and families, brings them out to him. Then he lures them to the water's edge and holds them under the muddy water until they expire, leaves them at the bottom of the bayou for the gators. His weird breathing, they say it's made up of the final gasps of each of the people he's ended. You can sleep tight now, they all tell me. The Bayou Man will only try to get you one time. You got lucky. I guess I did. I'm glad I didn't fall for his trick. My friend John recently convinced me to share this story that happened to us near McCall, Idaho. We'd like to hear what you all make of it, 'cause it sure beats the hell out of us. John's parents owned a lakeside cabin, and we had decided to spend the weekend there with our other friend Tom. We just planned on kicking back with a few beers, going out and enjoying nature. This place was quite a ways out of town, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Not another living person around for miles in any direction. We shared some laughs on our journey there, talking about all the things we were going to get up to. The place was a small but stunning log cabin, overlooking this picturesque little lake. We spent what was left of the daylight unpacking, cracking open cold ones, and swimming in that lake. We dived off the wooden dock into the water, cannonballing each other and just generally having a fun time. Nighttime rolled around, and the 3 of us were playing cards inside the living room area of the cabin. It was a nice, peaceful evening, and we were starting to wind down after the long day. Now, it was a relatively quiet night, but at around 11 p.m, things became real silent. Any rustling outside had stopped, along with the sound of the breeze and the hooting of birds. Out of nowhere, this eerie silence just filled the air. There was nothing suggesting danger, but we all looked at each other, like we all felt something strange in the atmosphere. It's hard to explain, but for a few seconds, the nothingness felt like something horrible. That's when this loud splash broke the silence. It sounded like something huge had just fallen from a great height into the lake. We rushed outside to see what it was. That's the curious part. The water was completely still, no ripples whatsoever. But there was something there. Something large floating in the lake. We got nearer to the water's edge to take a closer look. We could make it out now. It wasn't a thing. It was a person. A body floating face down in the water, arms outstretched. It looked like a man, and it seemed as if we were too late to help. The body was bloated, like a waterlogged corpse. Where the hell had he come from? Nobody else was meant to be around anywhere nearby. We all started freaking out, and John ran down to the wooden docks walkway to try and pull the guy out. I fumbled for my phone to call for an ambulance. Tom looked on in horror as John got to the end of the walkway and kneeled down to grab the body as it floated by the dock. As I was on the phone, I heard John shriek. Something had spooked him real bad. Tom ran to his aid, but John came rushing back to intercept him, pale as a ghost. Guys, there's nothing we can do for him. He's gone. Come on, let's get back inside. Upon hearing this, Tom looked concerned. Dude, he said, we can't just leave him there. We have to get him out. Tom started moving towards the body. No, Tom, said John. Not you. Come on, back inside, now. John's tone was so serious. I hadn't heard him speak like that in the longest time. It kind of frightened me, to be honest, and it definitely convinced Tom, who turned back and hurried inside the cabin. We all waited in the living area for the ambulance to arrive, looking outside every now and then to see the body still floating face down in the water. The old red and blue lights took a long time to get to us, but as soon as they pulled up, we rushed out to greet them. We told them about the body in the lake and went to point it out to them. But that's the thing. It wasn't there. The corpse was nowhere to be seen. Where the hell had it gone? Had it sunk? Divers searched the small lake and found no trace of a body whatsoever. The water was empty. There were absolutely no tire tracks near the cabin. Nothing unusual or out of place. Nowhere for anyone to go. Where the hell had the corpse gone? The man had been face down in the water for ages. He wasn't exactly in any condition to just stand up and walk away. If this was some guy just messing with us, we had no idea how or why. This whole experience shook me up pretty bad, but I honestly wouldn't be sharing this story if it wasn't for what John told me. Remember that John shrieked? Well, he hadn't told us what scared him so much that night because he didn't want to freak Tom out. But, in private, John confessed to me what had happened. He said that as he leant down to examine the body, the corpse's head turned up to look at him. Its hand grabbed his arm. Its face was charred, its eyes milky white. It looked at me, bro, said John. It looked at me and it said, "Why you, not Tom?" John told me this with complete sincerity, and I, for one, believe him. We've never been back to that cabin since, and I think we'll keep it that way. This is one of the only known pictures of the Leatherman, a traveling vagabond. Despite his story becoming quite infamous in Connecticut and New York, the Leatherman's true identity remains unknown. He was given his nickname for the simple fact that no matter the weather or the season, he always wore a handmade leather suit. From 1856 to 1889, he traveled a continuous circuit between western Connecticut and the Hudson River, a 365-mile route that took him 35 days to walk. Everybody along the trail knew the Leatherman, and he travelled the route with such accuracy that he'd always arrive at the same places within a few hours of when he was expected to. Whenever he came across a new scrap of leather on his trail, he would sew it into his ever-expanding suit. He hardly ever talked to anybody, communicating mostly in gestures and grunts. On the rare occasion he did talk, he spoke in broken English, and if asked about his background, he would abruptly end the conversation. Regardless, people fed him. When they offered him shelter, he'd always refuse. He lived in a series of caves along the trail that you can still explore to this day. One such cave consists of an 8-foot vertical chute that you have to climb down, and a small tunnel that goes 10 to 15 feet back. Even during the harsh winters in that part of the USA, he stuck to his routine and continued to sleep in his caves. Nobody knows why he lived the way he did, though medical professionals at the time said he was suffering from an emotional affliction. You can take that how you want. Regardless, he was judged to be of sound mind and was living a nomadic lifestyle by choice. He eventually passed away and was found with a French prayer book on his person. Most people agree that he was probably either French or French-Canadian. Still, despite extensive research, nobody at the time, or even to this day for that matter, could work out his true identity. The brass plaque over his final resting place simply reads, "The Leatherman." Tales and theories abound to this day. I admit this mystery isn't exactly creepy like all the others, but I'd never heard of this guy before, and I wanted to share his story. It's interesting to hear about local celebrities from times gone by, especially ones with unknown origins. Apparently, Leatherman tools are even named after this guy, so he clearly had an impact on people back in the day. Let me know what you think about this mystery and all the others down in the comments below. Perhaps we can come up with a few answers. The best things happen in the dark.